story begins in 2010 in my annual physical with my crusty, curmudgeonly old general practitioner who took his old stethoscope and listened to my heart and said, "You've got a heart murmur. Where did that come from?" I said, "I've got no idea." He said, "You got to go to a cardiologist." So I trooped off to the cardiologist, and they did an echocardiogram and told me I had mild aortic stenosis. I, of course, had no idea what that meant, but I learned very fast that it was something that I needed to keep an eye on. "So when do I need to get this fixed?" he said. "Well, you'll have symptoms." So I would go back every year for another echo, and it would be mild stenosis, and it would be mild to moderate, then it would be moderate, and in January of 17, it was moderate to severe. So I said, "What do I need to do now?" It said, "Well, you will have symptoms. You'll have shortness of breath. You will have some kind of angina, some kind of heart, some muscle contractions or something. You'll have a sign." I said, "Okay." So I went back to riding my bike 100 miles a week, and I was doing fine with it and no symptoms at all. My wife and I were in November going into a concert at George Mason Center for the Arts, and we were a little late. I let her off to go get her seat. I parked the car and was jogging down a short path and walked into the lobby of the Heart Center and thought, "I'm feeling a little lightheaded. I think I better get down on my knees." And I never got down on my knees. I woke up in the ambulance. And so they did a heart catheterization the next day and said, "That is a symptom. You need to do something about this now." So we talked to my cardiologist, who brought in a famous cardiac surgeon, all in their 60s, both of them in their 60s, and they really pushed the idea of open heart surgery. They said, "Listen, we know the valve will last a long time. With this TAVR operation, we only have data that goes back about 7 years, so you might have to have this done again." So I thought, well, that's fairly compelling. But then I talked to the guys who did both TAVR and open heart surgery. They were in their 40s. They were trained as interventional cardiologists. And they said, "Listen, you're going to be a good candidate for either one. You should do fine for either one." So I said, "Well, I'll take the TAVR." And they said, "Well, you can't just get it that easily." I said, "Why not?" I said, "You're too healthy." I said, "Wait a minute. I don't understand." They said, "Listen, the FDA has approved TAVR for high-risk patients that are on the verge of death. They've approved it for intermediate-risk patients who are pretty sick, but they haven't approved it for low-risk patients like you." So I looked at him and said, "Now, let me get this straight. If I were a drug addict, if I were way overweight, if I were a diabetic, if I were a drug abuser, I could get what I want. But because I try to keep myself in shape, I've got to have my chest cut open." They said, "Yeah, pretty much." So in that point, I said, "Well," he said, "we got a clinical trial here at this hospital. You get into it, you get a 50-50 shot, TAVR or open heart." So I said, "Well, if that's the best I can do." Then my wife made the mistake of watching an open heart surgery on YouTube. I walked in, she was sitting there in tears running down her face. We had lost a beautiful daughter to ALS 2 years before, and she was like, "I can't go through this again." So I called our doctor and said, "Listen, I'll go through your clinical trial, but if we randomize to open heart, I'm pulling out." And they said, "That'll screw up the clinical trial." I said, "Okay, well." So we sit down on our computer and start figuring out what our options are. We're talking about going to Germany to get it done in Munich. And then that was the day before Thanksgiving. Our son on Thanksgiving called a cardiology friend of his and said, "Go to clinicaltrials.gov. Never heard of it, of course. So click, clinicaltrials.gov. There's a 100% TAVR clinical trial 6 miles from our house out at MedStar Health in Washington. So the next day, boom, 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 we're out there. They said, "Oh, sure, we'll take all the tests you did out at the Inova Hospital." And about a week later, "Hey, you're accepted." Great. So we made an appointment on January the 9th. I go into the hospital. 2 days later, I walk out with a new valve. Presto, nothing to it. Yeah, I'm a great believer in Edwards Lifesciences because every single time my heart beats, I rely on Edwards Lifesciences technology to keep me alive.
Wow, that's a great story. Thanks so much, Whit. Really appreciate it. Let's give him a hand for doing the hard work of trying to find for him the right solution. So as a patient, sounds like you identified a few challenges along the way. I heard a little bit about a doctor, the kind of doctor that you talked to, which place you talked to people, where you got your information. What's your perspective from a patient standpoint after going through all of this with this one perspective? If you could tell, if there was a king that you could tell, hey, you need to change the way this works, what would you tell them?
The patient has to be his own or her own advocate. That's the key part of this. A lot of people just go, well, doctor, whatever's best for me, and we got to realize that sometimes they have their own motivations. I started thinking about why there was less of a history on the TAVR valves, why they could say, well, we don't know that it'll last longer than 7 years. I went out to your factory at Edwards Lifesciences and took a look at the differences between the valve they sew in open heart surgery and the ones they insert through TAVR. They're identical materials. And of course, the reason they said that was, we've only been doing this for 7 years. That's the reason. There wasn't a good logical reason why the TAVR valve should last less time than the open heart valve. So you've got to be your own advocate. You've got to think through the reasons why they're suggesting what they're suggesting. That's one thing. The second thing is that if you've got a disease that is going to kill you at some point, that you know you're going to have to get taken care of, I would have done it sooner rather than later, because my quality of life would have been better. I didn't have any symptoms, I didn't think, but my first bike ride after the TAVR, I had a lot more juice at the end of 20 miles than I did before. And I realized that it really had symptoms, I just didn't recognize them because they were coming so slowly. But if I'd had the TAVR earlier, I'd have won a lot more racquetball matches earlier if I'd had the kind of juice that I had after the heart valve. So you got to be your own advocate if you're a patient. And if you've got something like this, there's a real case to be made for having it done sooner rather than later.
So you're pushing for patients to be their own advocates. Some of the challenges I think that we have in the medical device industry is that the system is such, like you mentioned FDA approval and these different kinds of trials and your access to different kinds of trials. There are rules and regulations that govern what we can and cannot do. One thing that may not have been highlighted in the video there is that Whit lives in the DC area partially because his job is involved in politics and political activism. And so maybe Whit, from that perspective, you can tell us a little bit about, as a patient, what you think patients can do to lend their voice to help device companies or the device sector really improve the environment for patients.
I think patients are your best advocates and your best salesmen. Sure, you've got really good salespeople for your company. They're on your payroll, and they can make a compelling case sometimes. But if you have a patient who has benefited from your medical device, I think we've got a lot more credibility, not being on the payroll, but being the beneficiary of a medical device. When it comes to advocating for that device, I think we've got a lot more credibility. And then the other thing to do is just to think about who you know and where you can make a difference and where you can spread the word and help educate about these kind of devices. I'm fortunate in that I've done political work for 25, 30 years. The chairman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Lamar Alexander, has been a client of ours for 20 years. So I could sit down and talk to him about the FDA regulations. And by the way, I shouldn't leave this story without pointing out that a few weeks ago, the FDA did approve TAVR for low-risk patients. So now, if you're in that problem, you get what you want. You don't have to wait for some kind of clinical trial to go through in order to get it.
Great, that helps. Okay, so now thinking about it from the perspective of there's some people in the audience here who are contemplating, okay, that sounds like a great idea. How do I get patients involved? What is that? How do we do that exactly? From your perspective as a patient, or maybe just generally as an advocate, any suggestions for those of us who are trying to figure out how do we, in an ethically appropriate and responsible way, work with patients to help them tell their story with policymakers?
I think you create a network First of all, you put patients in touch with each other so that they can share their stories and worries and concerns and basically provide a support group for people in a similar situation. Beyond that, you can talk to them about who they know who might be able to affect things like regulations. And every person's going to be a little different. Every person will have a different community, a different network. So utilizing each patient's individual network, I think, will really help spread the word.
Great. Well, so you've had an opportunity to walk around and check out the goods, the products that Stryker and BioZimmer and BD are all making. So you see what we're trying to do here in our industry. Any advice for us in terms of doing what we do better?
Oh, it's a fascinating industry, and I can't presume to give you advice. I'm just really happy to know that after 35 years of playing racquetball and grinding all the cartilage out of my knees, that I can get new knees if I really want them when I need them.
Great. Well, Biomet Zimmer and Stryker and anybody else in the orthopedic business, here's a customer.
Thank you,
All right. Well, thanks, Whit, for your help.
Surely,
Appreciate
happy
it.
to do it.